My parents betrayed me, cast me aside like I was nothing, and now they have the audacity to ask for my help. It's a mess I can't even fully process, and here I am, trying to untangle years of heartache and injustice. I've always known, deep down, that I was the afterthought, the footnote to my brother George's glowing headline. He was the golden child, the favorite son, and everyone knew it, including him. Growing up, I could see it in the way my parents looked at him, how their faces would light up like fireworks when he entered the room. For me, their smiles were dim, polite, obligatory. From an early age, George wielded their favoritism like a weapon. He wasn't just my brother, he was my tormentor, armed with the knowledge that no matter how cruel he was, our parents would always defend him. I still remember the sting of his punches, the way he'd grin triumphantly while I nursed bruises he'd claim were accidents. When I complained, Dad's response was always the same: "That's just how brothers are. Toughen up." Toughen up? It felt like they wanted me to become a punching bag with no feelings, no sense of self-worth. When George wasn't physically tormenting me, he'd undermine me in other ways. Like the time I finally mustered the courage to ask a girl out, and she said yes. For once, I felt like I had something, someone, that was mine. But George couldn't let me have even that. He flirted with her endlessly, turning every interaction into a performance designed to make me feel small. She broke up with me after just a few weeks, saying she didn't want to get between brothers. I confronted him that night, my voice shaking with rage, but he just smirked. And my parents? They laughed. Actually laughed. "Don't be so dramatic," Mom said, waving me off like I was some petulant child upset over a broken toy. By the time I was 16, I'd given up hoping for fairness. I'd scraped together savings from my part-time job at McDonald's and asked my parents for help buying a second-hand car. They said no, claiming money was tight. A year later, when George finally passed his driving test after 3 failed attempts, they bought him a car, no questions asked. The kicker? When I turned 18, after weeks of pleading, they promised to get me a car. But George decided his was too old, so they handed it to me and bought him a brand new one. "It's still a car, isn't it?" Dad had said, as if I should be grateful for George's leftovers. The imbalance wasn't just material. It bled into every aspect of our lives, right down to our milestones. When George graduated high school, there was a party. Balloons. Speeches. A celebration of brilliance and potential. When it was my turn, Mom showed up late, and Dad didn't bother coming at all. That night, as we sat around the dinner table, I asked them why. They shrugged. "High school graduation isn't that big of a deal," Mom said. "You'll have bigger moments to celebrate." George, ever the opportunist, texted me later, "You know they don't love you like they love me, right?" I cried myself to sleep, the words searing into my brain like a brand. The final break came when I graduated college. Unlike George, who dropped out and spent his days burning through my parents' money with failed day trading schemes, I'd worked my ass off. Scholarships, part-time jobs, sleepless nights. My parents didn't even show up. Their excuse? "It's such a long drive," Mom had said, as if they weren't retired and sitting on ample free time. That was the moment I realized I would never win their approval. No amount of effort, no accomplishment, would ever make them see me as their equal, let alone their son. So I stopped trying. I cut ties, moved out, and focused on building a life for myself. And it worked. I landed a well-paying job at a company that valued me. For the first time, I felt free. Meanwhile, George's life was unraveling. After his day trading fiasco, he bounced from one low-paying job to another, his once cocky demeanor replaced with bitterness. I'd see him at Christmas, where he'd still try to one-up me with snide comments, but his veneer of superiority was cracking. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. Then came the call. "We need your help," Mom said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Help with what?" I asked, already suspicious. "It's George," she said, and my stomach turned. Of course, it was George. Apparently, he'd hit rock bottom. Lost his job. Maxed out his credit cards. He'd moved back in with them, and now they were struggling financially. They needed me to bail them out. Me, the son they discarded. "You're doing so well," Mom said, as if that justified everything. "We're still family." Family? The word felt like a cruel joke. I wanted to scream, to tell her exactly how much their family had cost me. But instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I'll think about it." Now here I am, staring at my phone, torn between fury and guilt. Part of me wants to ignore them, to let them stew in the consequences of their actions. But another part of me, the part that still longs for the love they'll never give, is considering it. I've always believed in karma, but this feels like a test. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to pass it. Though his cheap suit and hollow bravado betrayed the truth, George clung to his facade of success like a man gripping a frayed rope over a chasm. His barbed comments aimed at me, thinly veiled jabs about my cushy desk job, were easy to ignore. My paycheck did all the talking. The real story began 5 years ago, with my father's unexpected invitation to lunch. He rarely gathered the three of us together, and the formality of the request set my nerves on edge. The family business, a modest manufacturing firm my father had painstakingly built from the ground up, was floundering. As we sat at the table, the air heavy with unspoken tension, my father wasted no time. His voice, usually steady, wavered as he admitted the firm was in dire straits. "The manager's gone," he said, his fingers nervously tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "I'm getting too old to handle this on my own, and I can't risk hiring someone who might leave us high and dry again. I need your help. Both of you." George leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk. "You can't be serious, Dad." "Me? Give up my career to run a failing business? That's not happening." "Career?" I almost laughed but bit my tongue. George's so-called career was a series of dead-end jobs he hopped between like stepping stones over quicksand. My father's face crumpled, his desperation palpable. "Please, George. This business is everything to me. To us. Think of your mother." George scoffed, shoving his chair back. "You think I'd risk everything for this? I'm not a martyr, Dad. If the ship's sinking, you don't go down with it, you find a lifeboat." His words sliced through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. My father's eyes turned to me, pleading, hopeful. For a moment, I said nothing, letting the weight of the situation settle in. Every instinct told me to run, to protect the life I had built for myself far away from the family drama that had defined my childhood. But then I saw it, the faint tremor in my father's hand as he reached for his drink, the way his shoulders sagged under the burden of years of hard work and worry. I sighed, my resolve crumbling. "I'll do it," I said quietly. The room stilled. My father's eyes widened, a glimmer of gratitude replacing the despair. George snorted, muttering something under his breath about teacher's pet. But I didn't care. Over the next 5 years, I poured every ounce of myself into that business. Days blurred into nights as I revamped the company from the ground up. I overhauled production processes, implemented quality controls, and set up an online presence that brought in international clients. I even rolled up my sleeves to pack boxes alongside the employees when things got hectic. My father, meanwhile, retreated further into the shadows. He showed up for big orders and smiled for the occasional photo op, but the day-to-day grind was mine to bear. And yet, as the company flourished, I dared to believe that I'd finally earned his respect. Then George reappeared. He breezed back into our lives with all the subtlety of a hurricane. The prodigal son, disheveled and broken, dragged the wreckage of his failed marriage behind him. Donna, the whirlwind bride we'd barely met, had cheated on him and left him high and dry. My parents, blinded by their love for him, welcomed him back with open arms. A family dinner was hastily arranged. I arrived to find George comfortably ensconced in the living room, regaling our parents with tales of his misfortune. His tone was less apologetic and more entitled, as though the universe owed him an apology. When the plates were cleared, my father cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "I have something to discuss." I braced myself, sensing the storm brewing. "George," my father began, "we want you to come back to the company. To take over." The words hit me like a slap. I stared at my father, sure I'd misheard. "What?" He avoided my gaze, focusing instead on George, whose face lit up with smug satisfaction. "You've always been the one we envisioned leading the business," my father continued. "It's time." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Are you serious? After everything I've done, everything I've built, you're just handing it over to him?" My mother looked at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and discomfort. "It's not like that," she said softly. "We're grateful for all you've done, but George is the favorite," I finished for her, my voice dripping with bitterness. George leaned back, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Don't take it personally, little brother. Some people just have that leadership quality." I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You mean the quality of disappearing when things get tough? Of letting other people clean up your messes?" "Enough," my father barked, his face red. "This isn't up for debate." The room fell silent, the weight of betrayal suffocating. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out, the echo of the door slamming behind me reverberating in my chest like a final, irrevocable decision. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. They'd made their choice. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had to make mine. George had returned for good, his marriage in tatters. I nodded when he shared the news, unaware that his arrival would upend everything I thought I knew about my life. That evening, my father summoned my brother and me to his study. The room was dimly lit, the mahogany bookshelves casting long shadows across the walls. A faint scent of tobacco lingered, a remnant of his earlier solitary contemplation. He shut the door with a definitive click, and the weight of it sent a ripple of unease through me. "Sit," he said. His tone was brisk, cold. The air felt thick, suffocating as if it knew the storm brewing within him. When his eyes met mine, they weren't the eyes of the man I had spent years working tirelessly to support. They were steely, unfamiliar. "Start looking for a job," he said without preamble. "Your services are no longer needed. As of tomorrow, your brother will be taking over your position." The words didn't register immediately. I blinked, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. But none came. "Wait, what?" I finally stammered, my voice cracking. George leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm ready to take the reins, little brother. This was always meant to be mine." My chest tightened. I looked at my father, searching his face for a trace of the man who had once praised my dedication, my sacrifices. But his expression remained impassive. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I left my job. I poured everything I had, my savings, my time, my life, into this business. And now you're just replacing me?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," my father replied, his voice cutting through my protests like a knife. "This has always been the plan. George was supposed to take over, but his circumstances delayed it. Now that he's back, the transition is long overdue." "Transition?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the oppressive quiet of the room. "You mean betrayal. I expanded this company. I turned it around when no one else could. And you're throwing me out like yesterday's trash because your golden boy finally decided to show up?" George leaned forward, his smirk turning venomous. "Don't kid yourself, little brother. You were a placeholder, nothing more. Stop acting like you're entitled to what was never yours." My fists clenched at my sides. "Placeholder? I worked myself into the ground to save this company from bankruptcy. Where were you? Off playing house while I kept the lights on." "Enough," my father barked, silencing the room. His glare was ice cold. This is not up for debate. You were an employee, nothing more. And as your employer, I have every right to terminate your position. Be grateful I'm not making you serve a notice period. I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Does Mom know about this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, clinging to the hope that she might intervene. She supports it, he said without hesitation. She wants your brother to stay close to home. This is what's best for everyone. For everyone except me. The betrayal hit like a gut punch, leaving me breathless. I rose slowly from my chair, the weight of their collective rejection pressing down on me. Fine, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. Then you can pay me back every cent I invested. I'll take what's mine and leave. George scoffed, and my father's expression darkened. How dare you, he growled. After all we've done for you, raising you, educating you, you have the audacity to ask for money? You should be ashamed. Ashamed? I snapped, my voice breaking under the strain of my anger. You want to talk about shame? You used me. You let me shoulder the burden of this business while you waited for him to come back and take the credit. And now you're telling me I'm greedy for wanting what's rightfully mine. George's smug facade cracked, replaced by a sneer. You're ungrateful. Always playing the victim, aren't you? Maybe that's why no one wants you around. Something inside me snapped. Years of resentment, of living in George's shadow, of enduring my parents' blatant favoritism, came pouring out. You don't get to lecture me about gratitude, I said, my voice shaking with rage. You've coasted through life, handed everything on a silver platter while I scraped and sacrificed. You think you deserve this? You don't even know the meaning of the word work. Enough, my father roared, his face red with fury. You're done here. You'll get nothing, no money, no business, no inheritance. You don't deserve it. The finality of his words hit like a sledgehammer, shattering the last fragile thread of hope I had clung to. I felt tears sting my eyes, but refused to let them fall. Instead, I forced a bitter smile. You'll regret this, I said, my voice low but firm. One day, when this business falls apart and your golden boy can't save it, you'll remember the son you threw away. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, the sound of their raised voices fading behind me. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, but it felt like freedom. 6 months later, I was thriving in ways I never imagined. But then the call came. My parents' voices were frantic, desperate. The business was failing, they said. They needed my help. I listened, a mix of anger and vindication surging through me. When they finally paused, I said calmly, "Ask George. Isn't this his responsibility now?" The silence on the other end was deafening. For the first time in my life, I hung up on them. The news hit me like a freight train. My father's voice, usually so stern and commanding, now carried a desperate tremor. "We need your help," he said, pausing to take a shaky breath. The weight of those words sank in slowly, a mixture of disbelief and bitter satisfaction bubbling to the surface. My parents, who had once dismissed me without a second thought, were now pleading for my rescue. Turns out, the so-called golden boy, my brother George, had sunk nearly 90% of their savings, including their retirement fund, into crypto and reckless day trading. They believed his promises of tripling their money. Instead, one market crash and a few rug pulls later, it was all gone. And that's not all, my father continued, his voice faltering. The business. George has been struggling. We've lost contracts, clients. The workers can't stand him. I stifled a bitter laugh, the kind that bubbles up when irony hits too close to home. Years of mistreatment, of being cast aside like an afterthought, and now they wanted me to save them? I paced the room, the soft creak of floorboards the only sound as I tried to steady my breathing. When I finally spoke, my voice was cold, controlled. You must be joking. After everything you've done, you think I'd come running to fix your mistakes? To clean up George's mess? My mother's voice chimed in, indignant. We raised you, gave you everything. You owe us. I felt my pulse quicken, a sharp heat rising in my chest. Everything? I echoed, the word laced with disbelief. You mean the years of favoritism? The way you handed George the business I built up from nothing? Or maybe you're talking about the savings I poured into it, money I never saw again. Their silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For once, they couldn't spin their version of the truth. I continued, my voice gaining momentum. Let me remind you of something. You didn't just sideline me, you humiliated me. You treated me like an employee while I turned your failing business into something profitable. And when your golden child came back, you threw me out without so much as a thank you. My father snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. You're being petty. Family comes first, no matter what. A hollow laugh escaped me. Family comes first? Funny how that only seems to apply when you're in trouble. I let the words hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. If you ever contact me again, I'll take you to court. You'll sell your precious house if that's what it takes to repay me. Is that clear? The call dissolved into chaos, my mother's cries, my father's sputtering indignation, but I'd had enough. Goodbye, I said firmly, hanging up. The silence that followed was deafening but liberating. Over the next few days, the calls came in waves, from George, from my parents, even from distant relatives who had somehow been roped into the drama. My parents, of course, painted themselves as victims, spinning a tale that cast George as the dutiful son and me as the ungrateful, vindictive outcast. Only my grandparents stood by me. They'd seen the truth all along, having been my safe haven during my chaotic childhood. You did the right thing, my grandmother reassured me, her hand warm and steady on mine. It's about time they faced the consequences. Still, the accusations from relatives gnawed at me. I decided it was time to set the record straight. One morning, with a cup of coffee in hand and my laptop open, I began typing an email to everyone who had called me cruel. I poured everything into that message, the years of mistreatment, the favoritism, the unjust expulsion from the family business, and the thousands of dollars I'd invested only to be betrayed. I didn't hold back, detailing how my parents had lied to cover George's incompetence. By the time I hit send, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The response was mixed. Some relatives sent apologies, shocked by the truth. Others stayed silent, their complicity in my parents' lies now exposed. George, of course, sent a scathing message, calling me childish for airing dirty laundry. My parents followed suit, doubling down on their narrative. I blocked them all. In the months that followed, my life began to heal. Therapy helped me untangle years of resentment, and my career flourished in ways I hadn't expected. My grandparents remained my rock, their home a sanctuary of warmth and unconditional love. Every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering if cutting ties was the right choice. But then I'd remember the years of pain, the endless cycle of sacrifice and betrayal. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, and it felt damn good. As for my parents, they haven't dared to contact me again. In life, standing up for yourself can be one of the most painful yet liberating decisions you'll ever make. It's not just about drawing boundaries, it's about reclaiming your narrative, your worth, and your peace. While family ties may run deep, they are not an excuse to endure mistreatment or to sacrifice your well-being. As we close this chapter, remember, walking away from toxicity isn't cruelty, it's courage. Here's to finding the strength to choose yourself, even when it feels like the hardest choice in the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey of resilience and renewal.